Good afternoon. How is everybody? Thursday afternoon on one of the first days of fall. Anyway, my name is Tegan Blaine. I'm the Senior Climate Change Advisor working in the Bureau for Africa at USAID. And I'm so pleased to be here today to introduce this discussion. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks to Atlas for organizing. We really appreciate Atlas's leadership in working with USAID to keep this seminar going for the last few years. Although I often can't come, I do think that it's a wonderful forum for people to share what they're working on in the adaptation area and to have good conversations about a whole variety of relevant topics. And to basically exchange experiences, exchange research, and really have a place where we can talk about adaptation and international development issues. Personally, I'm quite excited about our topic today, which is about using lessons from social and behavior change from other sectors to apply to climate change adaptation. It's an issue that I and my team started thinking about several years ago when we were doing some research on climate-smart agriculture. A lot of the climate-smart agriculture world is interested in new technologies, new seeds, new farming processes, all sorts of new ways to address some of the stresses from climate change. But what we were beginning to discover was that the uptake of all of these new technologies wasn't really very high. And it made us really start thinking about whether the solution was a technological solution or whether it was a behavior change solution. Because even in situations where people could see their neighbor introducing new practices and being successful with those new practices, the uptake was fairly limited. And so I think over the last few years, we've really made some progress in addressing those kinds of challenges and managed to raise awareness of the behavior change ramifications for addressing climate change in particular. That said, we really still have a whole lot to learn. So this seminar is a way for us to continue this conversation, both among ourselves between different sectors, but also with all of you who are participants today. So today we're going to hear about examples from behavior change efforts in the health and conservation fields and talk a little bit about how those can be applied to climate change adaptation. We have 3 people on our panel. Each will speak briefly, and then hopefully we've got plenty of time for a robust question and answer and discussion period, and can talk about that can take any direction that people want to take. So please start jotting down things that you'd like to discuss as our panelists are speaking. We will go back and forth between questions potentially from the people who are online plus the people who are in the room. And so we'll just need to balance that a little bit. So let me introduce the people sitting over here at the table, all 3 of whom are just wonderful, wonderful people. Jan Eugen, and I stumble over your name every single time, so shout if I have completely mispronounced it again. Na? Yeah. Somehow I just don't get that NG combination very well. Anyway, Na is the Senior Water, Sanitation, and Hygiene and Social Behavior Change Advisor in USAID's Global Health Bureau. She's worked for 17 years on WASH, health and behavior change issues throughout Southeast Asia and also Africa. We were able to invite her to South Africa a few months ago to speak to USAID employees from all over the continent. And her work was so well received by my colleagues within USAID, and so I'm looking forward to her talk today. Megan Hill is an environmental protection specialist in USAID's Office of Forestry and Biodiversity. She also has been a champion of behavior change work to achieve conservation results. Prior to joining USAID, she worked as a senior director at RARE, which is a leading conservation organization focused on behavior change to address conservation issues. And I'm so pleased to have you here as well, Megan. And then lastly, Veronique Lee Bueller is a program manager for Atlas, the project that organizes this conference, or this seminar series. Atlas stands for the Adaptation, Thought Leadership, and Assessment Project, and is a collaboration between several bureaus at USAID to provide thought leadership and analysis specifically in the field of adaptation. And for many of you attending this seminar series, you've probably heard about other Atlas projects in the past, ranging from health to biodiversity and a whole range of other areas related to adaptation. But Veronique has helped lead the development of a report discussing behavior change, how behavior change can be used to support adaptation. And it's drawing lessons from other sectors, but also trying to address how adaptation is unique and how the behavior change lessons that have been developed from other sectors can be applied to the adaptation space in international development. We expect that this report will be publicly available in the coming weeks, and I expect that Veronique will talk a little bit more during her discussion about what's in that report. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Na. And just a note, I apologize, I'm going to have to step out a little bit early because I have a baby who needs to be picked up on the other side of the city. So Chris Perrine is going to be stepping in and helping manage the discussion after the talk. Thanks so much. Questions?
Okay, great. So I've got a mic and I've got a pointer, and so every presentation has its challenges, and this one will be a technological one. So thanks for the introduction. So I am based in the Global Health Bureau of USAID, and I serve as our behavior change advisor across our portfolio of WASH countries, which is about 30 countries. And when I started in this field in behavior change out of graduate school, there were two types of people who were interested in behavior change. They were the public health people, and they were private sector marketing people who were interested in converting people to their products, and we were interested in converting people into adopting safe, better behaviors. And I think within the last, I would say 5 years, there's been a huge interest from other fields in changing people's behavior. So now it's not just public health, it's not just the marketers. We have got economists, we've got politicians, political scientists, we've got education people, and we've got the marketers and designers that are all interested in how to change behavior. And so it's actually a really interesting and exciting time to be in the sector because we're constantly learning about behavior, but not just from our field, but from a variety of different perspectives and approaches, et cetera. So today I wanted to just kind of give you a broad brushstroke of where we are with behavior change in global health. I would say global health was the first bureau to really look at systematically addressing behavior change. And so I wanted to show you sort of look where we are, looking forward, and sort of where are some of our activities. So in thinking about all the people now who are interested in behavior change, it's brought a lot of a new lexicon, really, lots of new terminology to behavior change. So I wanted to start with, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the term IEC, right? It's a term, information, education, communication, that we used for the last 20 years. And the premise of IEC is that if we just tell people, and we tell them loud enough and repeatedly and more often, that they will change behavior. And so we realized that it's very limited, often having no impact by itself. So we thought, well, maybe focusing on knowledge is just not enough. And so we have to look at people's beliefs and their attitudes, their skills, their self-efficacy, their confidence in doing a behavior. So then we had a term called behavior change communication that was looking at not just knowledge, but still very focused on the individual. And after a while, we realized that actually individuals exist in an ecosystem. And we have to look at the individual and their ecosystem, in particular their social networks, the gender norms, the social norms that influence their behavior. So we had the term, and we still use this, still an approach, SBCC, which is social and behavior change communication. And it's widely used, and it's not necessarily wrong or anything, but actually we've evolved now to realize that actually if we put the C, the final C in SBCC, and we focus that, then the communication is already telling us what the intervention is. right? And so we're not really sure now, looking at some of our programs, whether communication as your key channel, your only channel, is the only way to change behavior. So we've dropped that C, and now we just talk about social and behavior change. That's it, full stop. And we don't talk about the C because we are now looking at other interventions beyond communication. And so then if we look at what is social and behavior change, it's looking to address behaviors, it's individual behaviors, it's looking at social norms, it's addressing also structural determinants, structural factors that can or cannot, or that can impede or facilitate a behavior. And so SECC is rooted in a lot of different disciplines, including social and behavior change communication, but as well as marketing, advocacy, psychology, and human-centered design. And I'll speak to a little bit of that in a little bit. So here, I don't know if this, okay. So here, it's just kind of a graphic showing you sort of where we've evolved, where we've come. So here at the bottom of the graph, you'll see here all the sort of individual determinants that we used to look at and we used to focus on in our behavior change efforts. And over time, we've actually moved up the table. And so now our focus, particularly in global health, is where are the determinants that I have put in red. And they are looking at both the social determinants as well as the structural determinants. So then what does that really look like on the ground for global health? So I'm going to kind of just go over 4 areas, including our sort of newer thinking on research methodologies, thinking on intervention design, looking at new audiences, and then concluding with behavioral typology. So when we think about our research methods, we are, for example, this is a research study that took place in Nigeria using human-centered design approaches. Now, if we want to talk about HCD, we could actually have an entire session talking about HCD and the differences between HCD and traditional social science research. But just to say, as a person who's done both, I actually find HCD to be a really fresh take on typical qualitative analysis. It's much more participatory, it's much more graphic, and it's really trying to understand beyond the barriers and motivations that people can actually tell you about. It's actually thinking through about their journey, like what would it take for me to go from my home experiencing a cough to actually me getting to a facility to be tested, for example, for tuberculosis. So what are all the sort of cognitive and emotional barriers, but actually what are all the physical barriers and financial barriers that I face in getting to the clinic? So some of the outcomes of the research activity is here. You can see on the left is a persona just describing what a typical patient looks like. But in some cases, you could have multiple personas depending on who you're targeting. And then here then is an illustration of the journey, of what it takes, where do they go, who do they see, what are the issues. So that is an area that we are focusing more is on using HCD. For our interventions, I was not able to make all the graphics fancy in this one. So if you just focus on the first picture, has anybody seen that in any of the airports? The men, I would have, well, maybe the women too. I've not personally seen this in the bathrooms, but the first picture is a urinal. And if you look closely, the urinal has a picture of a fly. And the idea of putting the fly on the urinal came from the cleaning staff at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. And they complained that, men were not really aiming appropriately. And so the result of which was there was a lot of backsplash, a lot of urine and just foulness that they had to clean. And so the cleaning staff were like, well, actually, what if we just put a fly right there and helped men to aim, encourage them to aim appropriately. And that actually, just that fly resulted in 80% reduction in urine backsplash for them, right? And there was no communication message, right? It was just the fly is there, so men kind of want to aim towards the fly, and boom, you have a reduction in urine backsplash. So the second picture is a study that we are funding in Ethiopia. It is focused on hand washing with soap. And basically what we are doing is that we are providing just the hand washing stations through an NGO, that hand washing stations and the mirror. And we want to see if students will just hand wash if there's only hand washing stations, but in the absence of health promotion. So there's no messages, there's just the hand washing station. And then whether, if we provide other structural interventions in the home, whether their caretakers will wash their hands before preparing food. And then finally, the last one is we in the WASH sector, we are always encouraging households to treat their water, so that's boiling the water, treating it with chlorine, and we've had very limited success. So now, instead of using all of our efforts towards promoting that, we actually just put the chlorine dispenser, the blue thing, on and hooked onto the water source so that when people get their water, it's already chlorinated and we don't have to communicate the benefits, the need for chlorination. So sort of all of these things are communicating a need to change something, or they're nudging people towards changing something without actually communicating the message, right? And so the whole premise of nudge is that you can design the environment so that people's choices are sort of nudged or corralled into a more positive behavior without actually talking about it. So nudges is an area that we're looking at, particularly for in the WASH sector. And looking at audiences, we traditionally always look at households, we look at communities, and we are always trying to change their behavior, their health-seeking behavior. Come to the clinic, get antenatal care, come to the clinic, get family planning services and contraception. But actually, when families and households arrive, the service provider is not providing optimal service. And that's because service providers are also human, and their cultural norms, their perceptions, and their attitudes about patients also affects their performance. And so we are increasingly looking at how do we change providers' behaviors so that they are providing the quality of services that we're promoting amongst households. And beyond communications, we're also looking at how do we change the physical environment in the health facility to facilitate easier performance, better service quality. So is that placing a hand washing device near specific rooms? Is it actually changing the flow of the rooms so that patients can go directly from getting tested for HIV to counseling in the very next room? And the last one that we're looking at is looking beyond the barriers and motivations to each behavior, but actually looking at the types of behaviors that we're addressing, because behaviors are not all the same. So we talked about vaccination for one vaccine. It's a one-time, maybe 2 or 3 time shot, right, to get your full dosage of a certain vaccination. But hand washing, it's every day. It's 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day. So those behaviors are very different. And then rather than saying that all behaviors require the same approach, we're saying actually if we could group them, maybe by frequency, maybe by other attributes, we would have a better understanding of how to address them. And then we're also looking at adoption versus maintenance behaviors. So this is my final example, and I just want to bring it back to us. And thinking about yourself, how many of you at the beginning of the year commit to more exercise, better diet, to lose weight, or to feel better, and you start all sorts of, exercise interventions, but then 2 or 3 months later, you find yourself actually not running, but you'd rather spend time on the couch. And so maintaining that pattern of exercise, for example, is challenging. So looking at adoption versus maintenance behaviors is another way that we're sort of segmenting and clustering our different approaches to looking at behavior change. And finally, so we have a couple of projects within global health. One is targeted towards improving the skills of our mission staff, actually our field staff in the USAID missions, to look at their goals and outcomes as behavioral outcomes, and that project is called Accelerate. But we also have invested a lot of money in a project called Breakthrough Action, and all it is gathering evidence on how to do better behavior change. And there are sort of two key areas of focus is looking at provider behavior change, and then the other one is also looking at integration. So when we integrate behaviors for behavior change, are we looking at benefits of operationally, mission staff just having one mechanism that looks at all behaviors, or would it be better, for example, to have several implementing partners co-locating and working towards addressing the same cluster of behaviors? So anyway, that's sort of the brief of what we're doing in global health, and I'm happy to take questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you. Now I'm just really jealous, mainly because in biodiversity conservation, I don't feel like we're at quite the same point as you. But first of all, I just wanted to say thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you all. It's really one of my favorite topics, and so I'm really happy to come and talk about behavior change. I'm going to talk a little bit about just some introductory comments following up on what Na said about behavior change. I'll give you some examples from behavior change interventions for biodiversity and integrated biodiversity and climate change projects, and then also a little bit about some work going on in climate adaptation that will lead into the next speaker too. So why does she have "Don't Shoot the Dog" on there? Well, people often ask me about resources for behavior change, and this is really one of my favorite ones. And it is a dog training book, but it also has tips for changing your husband's behavior or your own behavior. Karen Pryor used to work at SeaWorld and trained whales, and so I figure if you can get a whale to jump through a hoop for a little bit of fish, you've really learned something about the motivation and drivers of behavior. So as Na was saying, there's really a robust theoretical framework for behavior change that really comes from psychology, from communications, from public health, from lots of different fields. And it is a professional field, and there are behavior change specialists, which I think sometimes people forget that. Diffusions of innovation theory actually came from farming adaptation and how farmers adopted new varieties of corn. So I think for the adaptation community, that's actually really relevant. So it does really start from you. Similar models that people have go from pre-contemplation up to maintenance as to like your New Year's pledges that you might make. It kind of looks linear, but the image on the right is really the spiral because human beings are really complicated, right? So nothing is as direct as you might think. And we know that knowledge and attitude don't really change behaviors in the end. And so what our challenge is really to understand what the barriers are in the motivations of people. And this photo, I think we can all relate to what it's like to get a vaccination, right? You know, we've all been there and it hurts, but you see that benefit, right? It's really clear for a mother, maybe for you, about what the benefits of health behaviors are. But when you're working in the environment or climate change space, some of those benefits are really far off. It's all really obscure kind of concepts. And we as our human brains are just not meant to appreciate that right off. We have certain biases toward thinking about the present and not necessarily the future. So those are challenges, but there's also a lot of human psychology benefits that that can help us, and that is we have a bias toward thinking about how we'll be remembered, wanting to leave the world better for our grandchildren, or a bias toward thinking about what we can do right now, and that can be turned into something positive. And so also just this idea of pride, like everybody has pride, right? If go Caps, think about the parade we had, or that's a really fundamental nature that everybody feels, and wanting the best for your children, people, that's a common thing. And so just remember that in a little bit. This is where my jealousy comes in, because in biodiversity conservation, just getting the concept of SBCC seems like such a great improvement. And I think we do recognize we need to move forward a little bit more. But what we think of when we see this image is not just the communication, but there's also a role for advocacy and a role for community mobilization. So it's not just about telling people or communicating, but actually engaging them. So now going into some of the examples, and I apologize to the people online if I mess this up, and I hope I don't kill your ears. I'm going to show some video clips from 3 different initiatives that we're working on. And this first one is the Caribbean Marine Biodiversity Program. It's implemented by the Nature Conservancy. They were trying to work on coral reef conservation, and so they launched a campaign called Pass on Parrotfish to think about the role that parrotfish play in maintaining coral reefs. Also, there's been work with RARE doing campaigning for conservation to take those campaign messages down to the grassroots. So let me just play, and hopefully this will work, one clip from a fisherman that they're working on in that advocacy realm of the circles I talked about.
Mi apodo es Yamarco, me dicen. Comencé a pescar más o menos de los 13 años. Soy pescador porque eso fue el primer trabajo que conocí. Primeramente hay que tratar de limpiar la bahía, sacar las redes que está haciendo daño. Porque cogen muchos peces pequeños, pececitos pequeños, muchos camaroncitos pequeños, muchas jabas pequeñas. Y ¿tú sabes lo que hacen con eso? Eso es lo que hace que se mueren. Lo botan, ya están muertos. No quedan vivos. Cuando lo suben muertos. Y lo tienen que botar. El camarón tiene que estar tranquilo. No como está ahora, que el camarón está corriendo. Pero eso, la nueva red que están por introducir es una red para pescar tranquilo, lento. Es una pesca que conserva. Es una pesca que tú puedes pescar, subir, pues si hay algún pequeño, tirarlo al mar otra vez vivo. ¿Qué va a hacer? Se va a desarrollar. Si usamos la pesca de la suripera, en menos de 10 años se ve el beneficio, porque la bahía va a estar protegida, va a haber abundancia, va a haber muchos camarones, de todo va a haber mucho, de todo. No solamente soy yo que me voy a beneficiar, todo el que pesca en el mar se va a beneficiar. Nos ayuda a que así nos podamos desarrollar más, que no solamente vamos a vivir de la mar, de la pesca, sino que podamos vivir de otra cosa más. Yo me considero como un protector de la bahía, del medio ambiente, principalmente por mis hijos. Yo sé que va a dar resultados, van a decir, ¿y quién eran los que estaban luchando para que esto se conserve? Que mencionen mi nombre, o que un hijo mío oiga, o que un nieto mío oiga. No, ese era mi abuelo, que estaba en esa lucha, y se logró. Me siento muy bien.
Great. I thought that was a great video to show about some of those concepts in action there. Another example comes from Bangladesh and the USAID BAGH activity. I think a lot of times people working in behavior change miss out that this can actually be really fun at the same time. So this is an example of a tiger van that went all throughout the Sundarbans trying to talk to people about human-wildlife conflict around tigers. It also engaged rickshaw drivers as great passers of information and promoted competitions with rickshaw drivers about daring people to care for tigers. It also just built on that inherent pride that people have, and the tiger is actually the national symbol of Bangladesh. And so that was just another example of some behavior change work in Bangladesh. Last week, there was an article in the Foreign Affairs magazine urging conservationists trying to fight the wildlife trafficking challenge to learn from public health campaigns. And I'm proud to say that we have done a lot of learning from public health. This is an example of an interactive video screen in transit stations in China, actually, talking about the enforcement penalties around purchasing ivory and other wildlife products. there's a lot of work going on also in USAID Vietnam around rhino horn consumption. Vietnam is kind of the epicenter of demand for rhino horn. And this particular campaign is called the Chi campaign, trying to look from the energy within, trying to get wealthy, young, usually businessmen, to not think that purchasing rhino horn and they grind it up and put it in drinks at bars, that's one way it's consumed, that's not necessarily so cool. So here's another example of that campaign, and hopefully it didn't tell me.
Rừng tê giác không làm cho bạn ấn tượng hơn.
Great. In full disclosure, that was not funded by USAID, but it was a good example of this kind of communication, and that was done by a local Vietnamese NGO called ENV. I would like to say also that USAID has funded two, I would say, really groundbreaking formative research studies for the consumer demand for ivory, rhino horn, pangolin, and other species in China and in Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam as well. And that by itself, I think, is a huge groundbreaking research. It will give us the real information on why people consume wildlife. The next slide. So one more example is the WABIC project in West Africa. It's an integrated biodiversity and climate adaptation project. Its focus is on the coastal areas and mangroves. This is another video where she's going to talk about some of the work that they do in communication. So, yeah. Okay. I probably did something wrong.
No, you didn't. Bear with my sticky mouse here. I know.
For Fabic, my brother be don't send money to law because all the mango chicken they are around the village in Konola section. So right now the water they can inside now they clean up now out now they see the water now they waiting come. But like when Fabic don't can so it don't can teach you now. Because say person for cut the mango then waiting at the edge. So whether they can show you now for the planting, I will make my brother then go plant back the water don't destroy. Right now, if you go no more like Wongol or so, it's snap now the tongue. If they see the water now, where they count towards the tongue. So I'm glad for them. For whether they reach no more save their life, then can't show you this good method. Let God make it put us into practice.
All good still? Great. So another part of WABIC is implemented by PCI Media Impact, which is a social communications organization. Just last week, they held a creative design workshop for a 24-episode serial drama. We all love soap operas. Think Downton Abbey, Law and Order. So they will be preparing that serial drama as part of the WABIC activities. That social mobilization of messages is also happening through subgrants through these 4 different organizations with an overall target of trying to reach 20,000 people with 200 products. You can imagine this is an area where radio is really important because there's not a lot of communications channels. I just wanted to share, as I wrap up, kind of the common mistakes I've seen in both biodiversity and several other programs that try to do behavior change work. And the first one is really poor messaging. I think we have a tendency to try to communicate what we want people to know rather than kind of what they might react to. There's no also measurement of impact. None of that formative research that I talked about is actually trying to understand what the determinants are to the behaviors, no defined target audience, not working at the right scale, which is often a really big challenge, especially for climate change, and not enough budget. I call it the let's make a poster. They'll kind of default back to, well, if we just tell them, then they'll know what we should do. But instead, I think really good behavior change programs really identify and know your target audience, develop good messaging, share through lots of channels, lots of different ways. You test at the beginning, you test in the middle, and you test at the end, so if you can actually keep going with what's working. I think you have to also hire the right people. I think that it is a professional field, and people, especially doing surveys, can be really take a real skill to do, and then to budget appropriately. A lot of this work is not cheap, and you have to know that as you get going. I just wanted to put in a final plug for this report, Climate Change Needs Behavior Change, that was done by the RARE folks. I think Kevin spoke to you guys about 2 years ago. It looked, obviously, from an emissions point of view, using the data from the drawdown report, and it was really looking at what are the behaviors that are connected to carbon emissions. That didn't come out very well on the screen, but I hope you can go to the RARE website and download the report and take a look. Just some final quotes that I came up with that I really liked from the report. I think we know enough about behavior change at this point to know kind of what we might be able to do. It really can be a demoralizing task when you think about the awesomeness of this challenge, but it's also, I think, as Drew from Climate Interactive wrote in an editorial this past week, it's really a great challenge, but let's just do it. So I think that's the path we have before us. And I look forward to the work that Veronique is going to present about how you might look at some of the work like this did and looking at the carbon emission behaviors, about how you might be able to take a look at adaptation behaviors and see where you might get the most bang for your buck. There was a lot of research done in the U.S., at least, about what are the determinants to American farmers' uptake of new crops, and things like their attitudes toward risk, their attitudes toward change, what other people would think of them if they did something new. Those kind of more human psychology issues are kind of our big challenges as ourselves. And I figured, if you can get a whale to jump through a hoop, I think we can help people adapt to climate change. Thank you.
So as Megan just mentioned, we did have someone from RARE present at an ACM about 2 years ago, and if you did miss that, I would highly recommend that you check out the webinar recording that's available on Climate Links, along with a couple of other previous ACMs that we've done. So as we've heard from our panelists and Tegan, we recognize that SBC is an important but underutilized tool that has the potential to help the way people adapt to the changes that they're seeing in their communities and those that might be on the way. And so the Atlas project decided to take a deeper dive to explore how SBC might be applicable to the way that we design our programs for adaptation and broader resilience objectives. So the exercise began with a review of the literature from different fields, social and behavioral sciences. We also looked to the sectors that are kind of pioneering SBC work, so public health and biodiversity conservation, which already have a robust evidence base to, demonstrating that SBC approaches work and are effective at changing practices at multiple levels in diverse contexts. So through this effort, we wanted to uncover, in addition, what about climate change in particular makes people reluctant to change or adopt new behaviors. So we know that solutions that communities have traditionally used to cope with and respond to climate shocks in the past may no longer be sufficient for changes that lie ahead and unprecedented variability in climate change. Well, unprecedented variability and climate change. We also recognize that climate risk is often difficult to communicate and understand. Because there's a level of uncertainty intrinsic in climate projections, it can often be seen, it can seem like we're pitting an unsure gain against an unsure loss when we're pitching a particular intervention or action. So just think about, how many development projects have pitched as just one solution to the climate change, challenges that farmers are facing, drought-tolerant seeds, or drought-tolerant variety of a crop ahead of an ag campaign, and then lo and behold, it ends up being an above-average year for rainfall that year. So those kind of are, it can be a bit of a mixed message when you're trying to promote climate change adaptation to farmers that are kind of facing day-to-day risks that, their decision timeline is a little bit different from kind of the longer-term effects of climate change. And then sort of a corollary to the above challenges is the fact that the investments or decisions that we make to promote adaptation now often involve distant risk and reward. So what drives people to adapt or not adapt? Given the temporal and spatial uncertainty that accompanies climate change and its potential impacts, you can imagine why so many people are reluctant to change or unsure of how to change. So while there are myriad barriers to adaptation, the literature pointed us to a few determinants or factors that appear to be relevant and common within the adaptation context. Now, I don't think anyone sitting in this room or listening online would be surprised to hear that perceived risk plays an important role in adaptation behavior. People's subjective assessment of probability of risk is often not directly tied to actual risk or actual probability of risk. Instead, experience with recent or severe local impacts of climate variability tend to have a greater impact on or influence on the way people act and make decisions. So this is a really important consideration when we're targeting effective ways to convey climate risk. When information is provided by a trusted source and is relevant to people's lives, I think it can positively influence risk perception and uptake of adaptation behavior. But as we know from Na and Megan's presentations, and many of you know from your own experience, simply providing information about risk is not enough to prompt action. Individuals need to feel capable of responding to climate variability and change, and they also need to feel confident that their actions will be effective. In addition, how society may perceive a particular action can strongly influence how and whether someone actually decides to follow through with it. And I'll make a plug for another study that USAID commissioned in 2016 that Kagan alluded to about climate-smart agriculture and the adoption of that among farmers in Africa, which suggested that farmers will not adapt CSA strategies if they lower their capacity to address more immediate risks, even if those strategies are well targeted for longer term change. So it's again, it goes back to this idea of time and temporal uncertainty about what actions you can do now versus what actions you can take sort of on a longer term scale. And again, the farmers, from my oversimplified example that I mentioned earlier about the drought-tolerant varieties, they may not be 100% sold on this idea of, planting drought-tolerant seeds if they're facing multiple risks and multiple decisions that they need to make about their overall strategy for how they're going to plant their crops. But using SECC methods and approaches can help us zero in on some of these bottlenecks and can shed light on how we might structure our interventions to ensure the uptake of adaptation. So if we reframe the concept of adaptation through a behavioral lens, we begin to determine how all of this comes together. I think, again, a lot of you know that adaptation looks different depending on the physical environment and sort of the general vulnerability context. And while the overall adaptation objective may be similar across different groups, each represents a potential target audience or target group with different motivations, different attitudes and ways of coping with climate variability and climate change. Programs need to identify the diverse contexts and the pathways to coordinate complementary behaviors among a lot of different groups to ultimately meet that adaptation objective. Again, I think we're doing some of this in adaptation already, and we're thinking about adaptation as a set of decisions and behaviors, but challenging conventional wisdom and really revisiting our assumptions about what drives behavior and what drives decisions really opens the door for introducing new and innovative adaptation interventions, but also ensuring that those adaptations and those changes stick. And taking an adaptation SBC approach would mean doing formative research, as Megan and Na both kind of alluded to earlier, to assess which behaviors are feasible and effective behaviors to promote in a given context or situation. You need to also understand the priority groups, but also the groups that might influence them. And you need to unpack behavioral determinants from the perspective of the target groups in order to focus your interventions and identify entry points for changing behaviors, but also coordinating multiple behaviors. So I really like this example from the USAID Accelerator Behaviors website. This is through the Accelerate program that Na mentioned. And I like it because it shows us a defined behavior, but it also unpacks all the actions that are required in order to actually practice that behavior. So this is a little bit hard to see, but this matrix kind of breaks down the different steps that are involved and the conditions that need to be met in order to just, washing your hands seems pretty straightforward, but there are a lot of things that need to be in place in order to facilitate and make sure that that behavior is maintained. And so you have those echo behaviors or kind of related behaviors that need to happen in order to maintain that initial target behavior, but then you also have sort of the structural, social, and internal barriers, as well as key players and stakeholders that are involved in actually making that behavior stick. So where do we as the adaptation community go from here? I think that the work that Atlas is doing is really just scratching the surface, and it's really a first step in learning how SBC is applicable to climate change adaptation and resilience building. There's still a lot of work that merits further exploration if we want to be able to integrate a lot of these methods into our work. This requires a couple of things, I think. It requires us as the adaptation community to understand and really additional understanding of SBC and what it entails. As Megan mentioned, there's a lot of ways to do good SBCC or SBC, and it requires a pretty big investment in formative research to really, again, test our assumptions, re-examine our assumptions about what drives people's behaviors, so that way we can structure our interventions around those. The other thing that we need to do, I think, is continue to build a robust evidence base for promotable adaptation behaviors the way it's been done in other fields, primarily WASH and other public health sort of subsectors. And there's a lot of resources, there are a lot of resources available. I mentioned the Accelerator Behaviors website. There's a whole host of guides and toolkits that other public health or global health colleagues have put together, and those are available on Springboard and Compass. And then the other thing is just identifying ways to better measure behaviors and changes in behavior. We know that there are some best practices in adaptation, and I think we as an adaptation community are always trying to improve how we measure and capture those. And one place to start, I'll leave it for some food for thought, but is USAID's new Resilience Measurement Practical Guidance that was just published by the Resilience Center a couple of weeks ago. I think there are a lot of parallels between that guidance and SBC approaches, and it's a good, there's an opportunity there to really leverage some SBC methods like barrier analysis and audience analysis and audience segmentation and all those pieces that kind of form your formative research and can really help us move the needle on adaptation and help the communities that we work in. So.
Party for Atlas. So thanks to our presenters. Those were great. I think even for people who know something about behavior change, we all probably learned something. And when it comes particularly to the climate space, we obviously face some major challenges. So anyway, that said, open the floor to questions. I will give you the mic, and if you could just identify yourself and then ask your question. And if you want to direct it at a particular panelist, feel free to do so. Otherwise, you can just ask the question and they can give you their 2 cents.
Hi, my name is Shrikant. I'm from Energetics. My question is about the perceived risk. In developing countries, in my view, the only risk that really matters and that can motivate a behavioral change is the threat to livelihood. In your view, what could be the other factors? Because typically in developing countries, the thinking people are more concerned about short-term interests rather than long-term. And even if you look at the health outcomes, they're eventually tied to livelihood.
I don't know what other panelists might say, but I know in the Asian countries that I work in for wildlife trafficking, the survey data is super, super high on their attitudes toward if something is illegal, then I won't buy it. And so that is a great opportunity for us to combine our messages about not purchasing ivory, not purchasing rhinos, not purchasing penguins, because it is illegal. And there is an attitude of, I don't want the government to arrest me, or there is a certain fear or respect for the law there. So that's a big one that we try to promote.
Yeah, I mean, I think your example is a good one. I mean, I think it really depends on the behavior. It really depends on who you're talking to. I mean, if we're talking to people who consume rhino horn, they're not necessarily, they have a good livelihood. they're middle class, they're upper class. The money actually is not, it's not competing. They don't have competing priorities for basic livelihoods. When we talk about farmers, definitely. And I think, you know, some of the things that I hear when I'm in the field is that, like, we promote these ideal nutrition behaviors, like you should be feeding your child a certain number of portions, and it should be of a certain variety of foods. It should have all these colors. And then actually when you do the interview, they're facing like 9 months of food insecurity, right, where the mother's not even eating, and the child is barely getting just the pounded maize and maybe some vegetables that she can grow in her garden. And in the dry season, she doesn't have any. So I think it's really one of those things that we have to really look at. I feel like in those situations, what is the ethic of us promoting something that is just simply not achievable? And I think often the livelihoods is a huge competing priority for a lot of the health, the environment, the agriculture behaviors, because people really, the basics, the very basics of eating and getting, making sure that their kids can go to school, unfortunately, are bigger, are sort of bigger priorities than many of the behaviors that we're promoting.
Sure, I would just add to that, and I totally agree on the ethical ramifications of trying to change behavior. You have to really look at that seriously. That Pass On Parrotfish campaign, the kayaks in the video there was also an economic development activity. I think they realized that you couldn't just say, you know, stop your fishing practices or protect this parrotfish, but also we're trying to do small ecotourism opportunities to bring more income to those fishers.
Thank you, Neil Boyer, Peace Corps. My question is, in so much as you focus downstream on the individuals, at the upstream level in terms of policy, and when you mentioned, for example, the issue of mangroves or protecting reefs, and we know that one of the major issues is plastic bags. And we can say, well, yes, you know, we should try to do recycling, but we also have a number of countries that are banning plastic bags. So how do you use behavior change to impact those decision makers to expand, you know, plastic bag banning or single-use plastic bags?
Well, I think you should look to the District of Columbia for that answer. Lots of places are actually doing kind of what Na was alluding to, where it's not necessarily a communications issue. It could be a pricing issue. It could be an outright ban issue. The UK is really good at these kinds of things. Both the nudge kind of concepts that Na related to, and there's a whole unit in the UK called the Behavioral Insights Team that looks to what are kind of the process points that we can affect change. So not necessarily the individual's behavior, but the famous example out there around organ donation. In many countries in Europe, you're automatically opted in through your driver's license, not checking a box to opt out. Or they check a box to opt out. And so for us, you have to opt in order to do it. So their organ donation rates are much higher, orders of magnitude higher than ours are, just because of that simple issue. So that's what I would add on that.
Hi, Lori Ashley, independent consultant. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm trying to formulate my question here. I think it's coming back to this idea of perceived risk and what kinds of interventions depend on there being some sort of perceived risk and which ones don't so much. So some of the structural or nudges that we're looking at don't depend on a perceived risk, whereas some of the ones that Veronique was talking about are going more down that road. And so that kind of brings me back to something, not that you brought up about attributes of behaviors and sort of categorizing behaviors, and if there's ways to categorize behaviors such that we're thinking about, is the response going to be more effective in sort of a structural format versus more of a social behavior change format? And I'm not really coming up with a question here other than to just kind of explore that. I think when we think about climate change, we're so often thinking about climate risk and understanding and communicating that risk, and so it becomes this very risk-based approach, whereas I think some of the structural and nudge approaches would be really interesting to explore. So maybe my question is, as you think about some of the climate change adaptation behaviors out there? Are there structural or nudge kinds of interventions that come to mind in addition to more of the, in addition to some of the perceived risk-based ones?
Well, I think just what we're looking at now with the hurricane in the Gulf Coast, and you try to think about that perceived risk. Well, I think some of those people's attitudes have changed pretty intensely right now about the building codes, and when you see that image of the one house that stood because it was actually well built and everything else was wiped away. I think when you think about in the developing world, at least, I think when you go out in the communities and you talk to people, I think they have a pretty good idea of risk, actually. I mean, I think fishers will say, we don't see as much fish anymore, or we have drought year after year. So I think that that argument around this is a problem, I think that they understand it a lot better than we think they do. It's much more about the options and how can you help them work through, even in their own way, what their solutions are, and help show other villages and other farmers. I keep going back to this Malawi example where we talked to one farmer who was doing all the right climate smart ag things that we wanted him to do, and we're like, so why don't you think your neighbor is doing that? And he's like, you know, I started out in my plot and I did everything you told me to do, and I did it in the back plot so nobody else would see it because I didn't want to look like a bad farmer. And so that was the barrier of just that what people were going to think of me. And so helping communities work through those issues and really promote the champion, like, this is the good farmer, he's providing for his family, and to think about it in that kind of context and not necessarily think of it as an outside tool that has to come in all the time for adaptation behaviors. It's about how people can protect themselves and use those kind of angles. And for disaster risk, I think it's the same. Sometimes that's a policy level thing, literally, like don't put the road there or don't build it this way, and that's not an individual. Obviously, that's a government policy.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the perceived risk. I mean, all the original health behavior change models were addressing health risks and perceived risk, HIV, et cetera. If you don't do this, you'll be a risk for this and that. And we've just really discovered that just doesn't work for the majority of the behaviors. Like, when we think about water and sanitation, we're always threatening people that if you don't hand wash, if you don't get a latrine, you're going to get diarrhea. And actually, if people don't get diarrhea or they feel that they have self-efficacy, they can treat diarrhea, it's not a big deal. It's part of childhood. And so for us to market the risk really didn't get us very far. But then when we think about marketing the benefit, so hand wash with soap because you immediately feel fresh and clean and you feel confident and you just get all that gunk off your hands, it's much more tangible than talking about diarrhea. And for sanitation, for latrine promotion, for example, when we use our market-based approaches to latrines, we never talk about diarrhea. That is not what we're selling. We're selling the latrine because it gives you safety. It gives you status because your neighbor sees your toilet. It gives you peace of mind because you're giving a safe toilet to your elders or your children. So it's very much, we've definitely pivoted away from the whole perceived risk of diarrhea and disease, but focusing on more tangible benefits.
Hi, Natalie Bennett, U.S. Global Change Research Program. I have a question about this idea of measuring success. I think, Megan, it was you that mentioned that it's a common mistake that people make with this, and I know a big question in the adaptation space generally is, what does success look like? What does it mean for a community to be resilient to climate change? I guess this is a pretty broad question, but I was wondering if any of you had any thoughts about different metrics that could be used or examples of success, either in terms of adaptation or not, that we can speak to now.
I think that a lot of that depends, of course, what your goal is overall and what kind of intervention you choose. Often, at least on behaviors, you'll usually do like formative research, so you'll do pre and post surveys. So those things are somewhat easy if you, I don't want to say easy because it's hard and expensive, but you have pretty clear numbers around what people thought at the beginning or what they were doing at the beginning and what they were doing afterwards. You can also use observational data if it's a specific behavior that you can see. You can, as an outsider, you can try to say how many people, go to the hand washing site every, per day or not. One example from what I showed you, again, these get to be indirect indicators, but the IFA, the International Fund for Animal Welfare, and their work in China, so the billboard or the video, I think, in different brands, so not their own data, not their own research, just the brand awareness in China. The IFA brand is the second most, called back brand. And that was because they were blanketing China transportation networks with their messages. And so I think to them that really stands out in well, everybody, it's kind of like what we think of the WWF Panda. Like everybody knows the WWF Panda. Everybody in China knew the IFA brand. The kind of other ones in some of the environment or biodiversity behaviors that I work with, it's not all communications campaign. It's also doing some of more of what Na was talking about in terms of just reducing the opportunity to purchase items. And so that's also pretty measurable in terms of a lot of the trade is online these days, and we're getting a lot better at shutting down online marketplaces by working with the equivalents of Google and Alibaba and just all the online sellers to also trying to measure the efficacy of pop-up ads. Like those are the bane of your existence when you're online, right? But so is that really effective if you do a pop-up ad, if somebody Googles for I want to buy ivory, or the code names, because these all have code names now. So that's another way to measure. Sometimes there's room for creativity for these things, and you don't always have to go with survey data. But that goes back to your original campaign and actually knowing who your target audience is and knowing that behavior.
Before we wrap up, any additional questions? Okay, if not, then I'll just thank everybody again for coming, and I'll just give a few thoughts since I have the mic in my hand. For me, the behavior change challenges in the climate space are somewhat unique, and for me, it all sort of comes down to scale. It's the temporal scale, the time, and that is at least perceived in which the climate is changing. And to some extent, I think climate science has done itself, and those of us in the practitioner field a disservice by making it seem like it's somewhere out there in the future when we know that it actually is already happening. And I think conveying that to people is critical. And then the other scale issue, I think, is it's kind of an extension of what in economics is called the free rider problem, where individuals don't necessarily see a benefit from something, when something is really for the collective good. And so, I think that whether it's individuals and communities or countries might say, well, why should I do this, or why should we do this if everyone's not going to do it? Particularly when in developing countries they don't see themselves as having created the problem in the first place. So these are major challenges, and I think it gets to the psychology and obviously into the behavior change element of things, and we're just not there yet in terms of figuring out how to do it. But I think these are some of the core things that we've got to get to.
I just wanted to point out, Drew Jones's editorial recently was really impactful to me because it is really easy to despair and say, oh, it's all so hard, and what can we do, and especially climate change, what's the value of my contribution? But if you look at the graph in that report about, it was like over 40% of the potential emission impact comes from food waste or your dietary choices. And so that is huge at an individual level, that you really do matter. And to really not think of the social norms in particular can change overnight sometimes. If you just think about the impact of Al Gore in the movie, like that was like a tipping point, I think, in a lot of people's, it didn't take us all the way there, but things really did change for that. And some of the most intractable social norms in my work in Asia has been the issue of foot binding at the turn of the century in China. That changed literally, in the span of less than a decade, and that was based on perceptions of we want it to be modern, we want to move forward. And I think a lot of our climate change behaviors that we're looking at are the similar things. So I really don't give up. Don't give up the ship, and just do what you're doing with Atlas. And I think your guide that you're working on is excellent, and learn from others because it isn't new, right?
Okay, so let's wrap it up then. Again, thanks to everyone. And just as a reminder, first of all, the material from this session will be listed on Climate Links, climatelinks.org. That's an outward-facing USAID-funded website for those who don't know. And also for those who don't know, these adaptation community meetings occur generally on the third Thursday of every month. So we will have one on the third Thursday of November, which is the 16th? 15th. Okay, November 15th, next month, with the topic to be announced. There is also a listserv that you can sign up for on Climate Links, which will get you the announcements of these sessions along with all kinds of other great information. So I'd encourage you to sign up for that. And with that, I will be quiet. Thank you again.